All right, for those of you who have not done a flip lesson before, the way this works is it's just like I'm in class. However, there's not the wait time, so you will have to pause so you have a chance to write. The flip side is the video is then quite a bit shorter and you can get through it a little bit quicker at your own pace. So, where we leave off? We left off talking about the stages of the revolution, and we need to get a little bit farther into talking about Napoleon before we can do the next activity I've got for us. So, we had a National Assembly. They had written a new constitution that set up a limited monarchy. That's pretty important to recognize that the new constitution originally only limited the monarchy. It didn't get rid of it altogether. But it did want a representative assembly, something like what England had, and it declared that people had natural rights and that it was the job of the government to protect those rights. That sounds like an Enlightenment idea, right? And we're going to do an activity with this new constitution. This new constitution, if you want to write it off to the side, is called the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And Friday, we've got something to do with that. So, the third thing that this new constitution does is it brings the church underneath state control so that, remember how they didn't pay taxes? Now they're going to have to pay taxes. So this freaks out some of the France's neighbors, other European rulers, remember they're all related, and several nobles are going to be fearful that these ideas of revolution are going to continue to spread to their countries, and so they are going to declare war on France. So France is now at war. The war goes pretty badly. France is trying to fight a war on multiple fronts. And like most revolutions, this is the point where the radicals take control of the government. And they end the monarchy. They declare that Louis is a traitor, that his wife, Marie Antoinette, is a traitor. They have them both beheaded with this fancy new machine they've got called the guillotine. And the slogan at this time is liberty, equality, and fraternity. And for a 2-year period, we have what's known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is this time period for 2 years where Maximilian Robespierre, one of those people you need to know, leads this era of extreme radicalism and fear. Anybody who said really anything against the government, it was punishable by death. There's a story about like a 13-year-old boy who cuts down a tree that had been planted in the name of liberty, and they behead the kid. There's like something like 40,000 people who get beheaded in this 2-year period. And in about 1795, everybody goes, you know what? Maybe that's a little crazy, a little extreme. They, rather ironically, behead Maximilian Robespierre and attempt to bring order back to France by creating a new government called the Directory. There's 5 guys who are in charge, and they've got a representative assembly. The problem is they're pretty weak. And this opens the door for our famous buddy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon starts off this kind of hillbilly, backwoods, little bitty guy who is made fun of a lot as a little kid. He goes into the military, and during the revolution, he makes a pretty good name for himself. He is said to have held off a bunch of radicals by loading a cannon with a bunch of grape shot. So instead of killing them, it just maims them really bad, and he's able to stop a mob. And the he takes this story and has it printed in papers, kind of becomes Mr. Popular for his victories against British and Austrians in the war. Um, while he is in charge, though, he does create some pretty major change that really pays off well. So as much as history likes to look at Napoleon as this like crazy, lunatic, he really does bring about some ideas that the rest of the world continues to use. He fixes their economy. Things were bad. Things were desperate when Napoleon takes over, and he controls prices. He encourages business growth. He builds roads and canals, which creates jobs and also infrastructure so that people can then use those roads and canals. He starts the first government backed public school system. This is something that nobody had ever really heard of before. In fact, we didn't have it in the United States. But this is a way to make sure people have a basic level of understanding they can read and write. And it also makes sure they understand the law. And that creates a more peaceful society for him. And speaking of law, he also writes what's called the Napoleonic Code. This is a legal code, a series of laws, that is built out of a lot of those Enlightenment ideas. Things like the equality before the law, men and women having the same rights to things, and religious toleration. Napoleon really didn't care about religion very much. So his kind of absolute power as emperor is going to freak a lot of people out, but at the same time, he does bring about some good change. So he's one of those interesting characters in history that we love to hate, but we have to acknowledge the fact that he did do some good things too. So once he's an emperor and he gets himself voted emperor for life at the age of 35, he would start taking over. And he used the military to start spreading their borders wider. And when he took over a new area, he often replaced the monarchs he beat in battle with his friends and relatives. So, like, he puts his brother Joseph on the throne in Spain, for example. And he really kind of gobbles up almost all of Europe as it's known. At the end, only Britain and Russia are left. England, because they're an island and they had this really powerful navy, so they're able to keep him from being able to invade that way. And Russia is going to use their winters, and we'll talk a little bit later about why you don't invade Russia in the winter. So here's an example of all the blue area is areas that Napoleon is going to take over and put his buddies in charge of. So Napoleon's empire falls for several reasons, but the three big ones that we're going to be worried about are nationalism, that failed Russian invasion, and the alliance system that comes into play. Nationalism, we're going to start talking about it here, but it's really going to become a common theme throughout the rest of the term. So if it's not quite clear what it is, I need to know on Friday so that we can go over it again. But nationalism is this pride in your country to the extent that you think they're the best, but you're not willing to recognize that anybody else could be good as well. Nationalism can often take the guise of, we talk about that hillbilly America kind of thing where you're not even willing to listen about any other country because there's no possible way they could possibly be anywhere good as you and poo on them kind of thing. Well, it kind of gets its start with the French Revolution and Napoleon. People Napoleon had taken over, countries where he had taken over, saw the French as these outsiders, these foreign oppressors. So people who had a similar language and similar customs would band together to get rid of the outsiders. So they revolt against French rule, and this kind of pride in your own story, your own heritage, to the extent that you're willing to mistreat others, it starts to define nationalism. The second reason is that failed Russian invasion. The Russians used a policy called scorched earth policy, and I think that's one of your terms, where you destroy anything that could possibly be of use to the enemy. So the Russian people would burn their crops and poison their own wells and kill their own cattle, burn houses down, and retreat before the French could get there. So that the French had to extend these supply lines like super long, and then the Russians could then cut them off. Because of this policy and the oncoming winter, most of Napoleon's army is going to be lost during this battle, or not even call it a battle, this attempted invasion. And it's going to really weaken his ability to hold on to his empire. At the same time, the Russians, the British, the Austrians, and the Prussians are going to team up to fight him. They beat him the first time, send him off to an island in just outside of Italy, Corsica, and he's going to escape. And he escapes back into Europe, and he has this like 100-day period where he is going to rile things back up, and Russia, Britain, Austria, and Prussia are going to freak out and be like, this can't happen. So they're going to team up again, and he's going to ultimately lose at the Battle of Waterloo. And you could spend, if you take history of war, you can spend a week on the Battle of Waterloo. But for the purpose of this class, you just need to know he lost. And then instead of putting him on an island just outside of Europe, they put him on an island in the middle of nowhere off the coast of Africa. And he never escapes that. He eventually is going to die of a fever. So this is a painting kind of showing scorched earth and the evacuation of Moscow. And this one is a painting representing kind of like how desperate people were, those soldiers were as they were retreating from Russia in the winter. We're going to stop here. We're not going to go over the Congress of Vienna. We'll start here on probably next week because we have a different activity for Friday. So hopefully you got what you needed to get. And if there's something you missed or something we need to clarify, please let me know on Friday and we can take a few minutes to do that. And then we're going to do an activity. So I will see you then.